Baking bread from scratch isn't just a task for the Amish, it's a way of life. While the rest of us might toss ingredients into a machine, push a button, and call it a day, the Amish approach is slower, quieter, and honestly, way more soulful. They rely on the simple power of their hands, a few tools, and patience to get the job done. It all begins with the basics, gathering the right ingredients. Now that might sound straightforward, but here's the twist. Many Amish families don't just pick up flour from the nearest store like we do. Nope. They either mill their own grains or get flour directly from neighboring farms. Imagine knowing exactly where every bit of your bread comes from, right down to the wheat stalk it grew on. It's a whole other level of farm to table that makes you wonder what kind of magic you're missing when you grab a plastic-wrapped loaf from the supermarket. Good bread starts long before the first pinch of flour hits the bowl. For the Amish, gathering ingredients is almost an art form, a commitment to quality that borders on philosophy. Sourcing ingredients locally isn't just about flavor. It's about building relationships. Amish farmers don't operate like a typical grocery store. There's a lot of trust involved. Handshakes, not contracts. Flour from a nearby mill, eggs from the neighbor's chickens, and maybe honey from a cousin's beehives. It's a supply chain that would make any corporate executive jealous, but without all the emails and spreadsheets. And these connections aren't just about business, they're personal. When your flour comes from a friend down the road, you're not just baking bread, you're honoring their hard work, too. It's not all sunshine and roses, though. Sometimes the harvest isn't as good as you hoped. I've heard stories from Amish families who had to get creative when crops didn't cooperate, subbing out one kind of grain for another or stretching what they had to make things last. It's not so different from how our grandparents lived during tough times, turning whatever they had into something edible. And somehow, those make-do loaves always end up tasting the best, like a reminder that good things come from perseverance. I remember trying to bake with flour that had sat too long in my pantry. Turns out, freshness really does make a difference. What came out of the oven that day was more brick than bread. Lesson learned. The Amish are also big believers in organic farming, long before it became trendy. No synthetic chemicals, no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned crop rotation and compost. It's the kind of farming that takes longer and demands more effort, but it keeps the soil healthy for the next generation. And when you bake bread with grains grown this way, you can taste the difference. It's like comparing a backyard tomato to one of those watery ones from the supermarket. There's just no contest. And then, of course, there's the sweet stuff. Not all Amish bread is plain. Some families add a little honey or molasses for special occasions, giving the bread a rich, warm flavor. It's funny how just a spoonful of honey can transform a basic loaf into something worth fighting over at the dinner table. I once tried sneaking an extra slice at a friend's Amish home, thinking no one would notice. Let's just say I learned that Amish grandmothers don't miss much. They've got eyes in the back of their heads. But hey, when the bread's that good, it's worth getting caught. Once the ingredients are gathered, the real work begins. No electric mixers, no fancy gadgets, just a bowl, a spoon, and hands that know their way around dough. There's something oddly satisfying about dumping flour, yeast, salt, and water into a bowl and stirring it all together. At first, it feels easy enough, but as the dough thickens, it becomes a bit like wrestling an enthusiastic toddler, sticky, stubborn, and just heavy enough to make you second-guess your choices. The Amish don't seem to mind this part, though. In fact, they lean into it. There's a kind of rhythm to mixing by hand, almost like dancing to a beat only the dough can hear. Scoop, stir, fold, repeat. It's the kind of quiet work that makes you focus, slow down, and forget, for a little while, that the world is rushing by. Mixing by hand also teaches you patience. The dough doesn't come together instantly. There are always dry patches that seem to play hide and seek at the bottom of the bowl. You might think, surely I need just a little more water, but overdoing it leads to a sticky mess you'll be scraping off your hands for the next 20 minutes. The trick, something it took me a while to figure out, is to let the dough teach you what it needs. Too dry? Add just a splash. Too sticky? Dust and some flour. It's almost meditative, like you're in a silent conversation with the ingredients, and every time you listen, the dough rewards you by coming together a little better. The Amish would probably laugh at my early attempts at mixing dough. One time, I got so frustrated that I dumped everything into a stand mixer thinking, what's the harm? As soon as I flipped the switch, flour exploded out of the bowl like a mini volcano. I stood there, covered in flour, realizing I'd just broken the first rule of making bread the old-fashioned way. Respect the process. I cleaned up the mess and started over, back to stirring by hand, feeling a little more humble, but also oddly determined. There's a quiet charm in knowing that you're doing something the same way people did hundreds of years ago with no shortcuts. The fact that it's a workout for your arms is just a bonus. Who needs a gym when you've got bread dough to mix? It's also worth noting that mixing by hand isn't just about the result, it's about connection. You feel the texture change as you stir. You smell the yeast as it starts to activate. You notice little things like how the dough pulls away from the sides of the bowl when it's just right. It becomes more than a chore. It's a reminder of how satisfying simple tasks can be. The only product we'll ever promote on our channel is a book by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, about 126 superfoods and preservation methods from crisis times like the Great Depression and wartime that are impossible to find elsewhere. We decided to promote his book because we are the last generation able to share these techniques and superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be a shame to see this information about highly nutritious foods and preservation methods to survive crises disappear. You can also find a book about herbal remedies from Nicole Apelian on their store. If you're watching this on TV, you can look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet and find the books by clicking the link in our channel description or any other video description. When was the last time stirring something made you feel accomplished? Mixing dough forces you to stay present in the moment. If you rush it, the dough notices, and you'll pay for it later when it refuses to rise properly or ends up with the consistency of a brick. Kneading dough is where things start to get serious. You've mixed the ingredients, and now it's time to put in the elbow grease, literally. There's no fancy stand mixer to hide behind here, just you, the dough, and the table. At first, the dough feels sticky, stubborn, like it's testing your patience, but that's the beauty of it. Kneading isn't just about folding and pressing dough, it's about persistence. You stretch, fold, turn, and repeat until the dough finally gives in and transforms beneath your hands. Somewhere between the first push and the 100th, it softens up, becoming smooth and elastic. If you've never kneaded before, let me warn you, it can feel like a workout. I swear, after my first loaf, I thought my forearms were going to file a complaint, but the satisfaction that follows is worth every second. The Amish folks have this down to an art. Their hands move with the kind of rhythm that only comes from years of experience, like musicians practicing scales. Watching an Amish baker knead dough is mesmerizing. They know just when to fold it over and how much pressure to apply. And they do it all without timers or recipes, relying instead on feel. You know the dough is ready when it springs back slightly after a gentle poke, like a bread version of a high five. If you're not sure, one trick is to stretch a bit of the dough until it forms a thin, almost transparent window without tearing. That's when you know you've nailed it. They call it the window pane test, but honestly, it feels more like magic. Kneading is more than just technique, though. It's therapy. There's something strangely soothing about the repetitive motion, almost like meditation. Some people pay good money for stress balls or yoga retreats, but all you need is a lump of dough. Just 10 minutes into the process, whatever was bothering you fades away, and it's just you and the rhythm. I once read that bakers live longer than average folks, and after spending time kneading, I can see why. It's like free therapy with bread at the end. Who could ask for more? And don't think the Amish take it too seriously. There's room for fun, too. One Amish man joked that kneading dough is like wrestling a very polite bear. It fights back a little, but if you keep at it, it'll play nice in the end. And he wasn't wrong. The dough does seem to have a personality of its own, especially on humid days when it stubbornly refuses to cooperate. Ever try kneading in the summer heat? It's like wrestling a wet sponge, but hey, at least you'll have something tasty at the end of the battle. If you're lucky, you might even catch a glimpse of an Amish family turning kneading into a group effort. It's not uncommon for kids to help out, tiny hands pressing into the dough with all the seriousness of a seasoned baker. They might not always get it right. The loaves sometimes come out lumpy or uneven, but no one seems to mind. It's all part of the process. And honestly, there's something special about bread that looks homemade, imperfections and all. You know it was made with love, and that makes it taste better than anything you could buy in a store. Kneading might sound old-fashioned, especially in a world full of bread machines and dough hooks, but there's something deeply satisfying about doing it by hand. It connects you to the past, to the generations who did it this way long before electricity was even a thing. When you knead dough, you're participating in a tradition that goes back centuries, if not longer. It's humbling, really. I like to think that if there were an Olympic event for bread kneading, the Amish would take the gold without breaking a sweat. And honestly, they'd probably bake a loaf for the silver and bronze winners just because they could. This is the part where the dough gets a well-deserved break, and you do too. After all that kneading, it needs some downtime to puff up and show what it's made of. For the Amish, this step is about more than just waiting. It's about patience and trust. You've done your part, and now you let nature take over. The trick? Finding the right spot. Amish bakers often cover their dough with a cloth and tuck it into a cozy, warm corner, away from drafts. Some might say it's like putting a baby down for a nap. You hope it rises peacefully, but sometimes things get unpredictable. Temperature plays a huge role here, and without modern thermostats, the Amish rely on instinct. Too cool and the dough sulks, refusing to rise. Too warm and it races ahead like it's training for a marathon. I once left dough to rise on the windowsill, thinking a little sunshine would speed things up. Well, 3 hours later, I came back to find it had doubled and kept going. It looked like it was trying to escape the bowl, all swollen and bubbly like a dough monster planning a kitchen takeover. I had to punch it down just to stop it from spilling onto the counter. And let me tell you, there's a strange satisfaction in deflating a puffed up dough. It's like popping bubble wrap, but with a purpose. Flavor is another reason the Amish take rising so seriously. When the yeast gets to work, it's not just blowing bubbles, it's developing those subtle flavors that make homemade bread taste leagues better than anything from a supermarket shelf. Some bakers even let their dough rise overnight, allowing it to ferment slightly and create a deeper, almost tangy flavor. You could say bread has a personality. It needs time to mature, just like a fine cheese or a good joke. And speaking of time, this step teaches you a thing or two about patience. There's no rushing it, no shortcuts. If you try to skip ahead, you'll end up with a sad, dense loaf that even a duck at the pond might turn its beak up at. The Amish don't stress over the weight, though. They find ways to make the most of it. While the dough rises, there's usually time to churn butter, sweep the porch, or swap a few stories over coffee. It's not just about filling time. It's about knowing that good things come to those who wait. And honestly, there's something magical about uncovering the dough after a good rise. It's gone from a rough, lumpy mess to a smooth, airy puffball, like it's been practicing yoga while you weren't looking. A well-risen dough practically begs to be shaped and baked, ready to fulfill its breadly destiny. Of course, things don't always go smoothly. I've learned the hard way that dough has a mind of its own. Once I got distracted mid-rise and forgot about it for hours. When I finally remembered, the dough had grown so much that it was oozing over the sides of the bowl, looking like it wanted to explore the fridge. It was a sticky situation, but I managed to salvage it. I like to think that every loaf comes with a little bit of chaos. It makes the final result that much sweeter. Once the dough has risen to perfection, it's time to move on to the next step, shaping the loaves. This is where the dough gets its personality. Whether it ends up as a neat loaf, a soft roll, or a braided work of art for a special occasion. But first, a good stretch and fold will give it that final bit of strength it needs to hold its shape in the oven. Because if the rise was all about patience, shaping the dough is where you get to have a little fun. Now comes the fun part, shaping the dough. After all that waiting, the dough is finally ready to become what it was always meant to be, a loaf of bread, or maybe a roll or a braided beauty. There's something satisfying about scooping it out of the bowl, still warm and stretchy from rising, and coaxing it into its final form. This part isn't just practical, it's creative. Some Amish bakers treat shaping like an art form. For everyday loaves, they might go for simple rounds or batards, but special occasions call for braided breads, often woven with 3, 5, or even 6 strands. I tried braiding a loaf once, and let's just say it turned out to be more modern art than masterpiece. But hey, even the messiest loaf still tastes good. Amish communities value tradition, and certain shapes carry meaning. A braided loaf might show up at a wedding or church gathering, symbolizing unity and strength. Other shapes, like small, perfectly rounded rolls, are the kind of thing you'd find on a dinner table during Sunday supper. One for everyone, and maybe an extra one for the family dog who's patiently waiting under the table. There's a sense of pride in creating something beautiful, even if it's just going to be eaten in a few hours. If the dough tears or stretches a little funny, that's just part of its charm. Bread, like people, doesn't have to be perfect to be loved, but don't let the simplicity fool you. Shaping dough takes some muscle. Folding, tucking, and pinching the edges tight requires steady hands and a bit of practice. It's like wrestling with a toddler who refuses to sit still. One minute the dough cooperates, and the next, it's sticking to everything. You have to be firm with it, but not too aggressive. Push too hard, and the dough flattens like a pancake. Be too gentle, and it sags in the middle. Some Amish bakers say shaping dough builds character. What's good bread without a little struggle? The texture matters too. The goal is to get the surface tight and smooth, creating tension so the loaf holds its shape while baking. I once made the mistake of being a little too casual with my shaping, just sort of flop the dough into a pan and hope for the best. The result? A loaf that looked like a deflated football. That's when I learned that shaping isn't just for looks, it's about structure. The dough needs to know it's going places, like a kid told to sit up straight during family photos. Some Amish bakers even slap the dough on the counter a few times for good luck, though they'd never admit that it's anything other than practical technique. Rolling dough into buns or twisting it into pretzels isn't just about feeding the family. It's a rhythm passed down through generations. Kids learn by watching their parents, sneaking little bits of dough to play with, and maybe even getting scolded when they poke holes in the perfect loaf their mother just shaped. But those moments stick with you, like flour on your hands. Once the dough is shaped and rested, it's time for the moment of truth: baking. For the Amish, this step isn't just about following instructions on a fancy electric oven. It's about skill, intuition, and a bit of trial and error. Many Amish homes use wood-fired or brick ovens, which bring their own challenges. Unlike modern ovens, these traditional ones don't come with digital thermostats that chirp at you when they're ready. Instead, it's a game of, is the oven hot enough? And the only way to know for sure is to test the heat with a sprinkle of flour on the stone. If it turns golden brown in seconds, it's time to bake. If it burns instantly, well, maybe it's time for a quick coffee break while things cool down. Wood-fired ovens aren't just about baking bread. They're an experience. The fire has to be started early, sometimes hours before baking, to give the oven time to reach the right temperature. In the middle of summer, that means heating up the kitchen until it feels like a sauna. But once the fire gets going, there's no stopping it. You'll see bakers adding logs, adjusting airflow, and occasionally waving away smoke like they're conducting an orchestra of flames. I once tried baking in a wood oven myself, thinking it would be a rustic little adventure. It ended with me fanning the smoke alarm while my loaf turned into something more like a brick than bread. I guess some things are better left to the experts. Controlling temperature in these ovens is a skill passed down through generations. Some Amish bakers can tell when the oven is ready just by feeling the air inside. They'll reach their hand in for a second or two, just long enough to test the heat without singeing off their eyebrows. If you ask them how they know when it's perfect, they'll shrug and say, "You just know." It's the kind of knowledge that comes from years of practice, like knowing exactly how long to steep your tea or how to skip commercials on TV without missing anything. What's fascinating is that each oven has its own personality. Some ovens run hotter on one side, others cool down quicker than expected, and a few seem to have moods, cooperative one day, stubborn the next. But that unpredictability is part of the charm. It's not about perfection, it's about the journey. The Amish say that the bread reflects the baker's state of mind. If you're calm and patient, the bread will behave. But if you're in a hurry or distracted, the loaf might come out lopsided, just to keep you humble. Let me tell you, baking in a wood-fired oven creates an aroma that's impossible to resist. It seeps into every corner of the house, sticking to clothes and lingering long after the bread is pulled from the oven. Once I tried to sneak a slice before the loaf had properly cooled, but the bread protested by crumbling under my knife. Lesson learned: patience is not optional when it comes to good bread. With traditional baking, the process becomes part of the ritual. There's no rushing, no shortcuts. The bread is ready when it's ready, and that's the beauty of it. Once the loaves are safely in the oven, the trickiest part begins. knowing exactly when to pull them out. If you've ever baked, you know the battle. It's not as easy as setting a timer and hoping for the best. The Amish approach timing like a dance, a rhythm built from experience rather than a kitchen clock. Sure, you could count minutes, but bread isn't interested in following your schedule. It has its own sense of time, and getting it just right is about being fully present, watching, smelling, and listening. The first cue is the smell. As the bread bakes, the aroma changes from yeasty to nutty and warm, filling the air with that unmistakable scent that makes even the strongest resolve crumble. I'm not ashamed to admit I've hovered around the oven, waiting for that exact moment when the smell shifts, convinced that just maybe it's ready. And naturally, my impatience has resulted in more than one loaf with a pale crust and doughy middle. Timing, it seems, is a virtue I'm still working on. The Amish rely on simple but effective cues. The color of the crust is one. It should be a deep golden brown, just on the edge of turning dark. If the bread is pale, it's not ready. If it's too dark, well, maybe you've just made extra crispy toast. A gentle tap on the bottom of the loaf is another old school trick. If it sounds hollow, it's done. If not, back into the oven, it goes. And yes, that means flipping hot bread with your bare hands. It's not for the faint of heart, but a good baker knows that sometimes bravery in the kitchen is a requirement. Opening the oven door too soon is another rookie mistake. It's tempting, just a peek, you tell yourself. But opening that door before the bread has set can be disastrous. The sudden drop in temperature causes the dough to collapse faster than a poorly built souffle. It's like watching a suspenseful movie and fast-forwarding to the big twist too early. The moment is ruined, and there's no taking it back. A baker's patience, I've learned, is rewarded with perfection, or, at the very least, an uncollapsed loaf. Timing also changes with the seasons, which is part of the charm and challenge of traditional baking. A bread that took 30 minutes in winter might need 5 minutes less in the heat of summer. Some say it's the temperature of the kitchen. Others swear it's the humidity in the air. One Amish friend told me, with a wink, that bread just has a mind of its own and doesn't like to be rushed. Kind of like kids, she said. You have to give it space to grow, or it'll rebel. Experienced bakers develop an instinct for timing that's almost magical. They know when a loaf is done just by the way the crust pulls back slightly from the edges of the pan or how the surface crackles as it cools. No clock, no thermometer, just the kind of knowledge you only get after baking hundreds of loaves. I once asked an older Amish baker if she ever used a timer. She smiled and said, "I trust my nose more than a clock." I couldn't argue with that. Now comes the hardest part, waiting. The bread might look perfect, the aroma filling the house like some kind of edible magic, but diving in too early is a rookie mistake. The Amish know better than to rush this step because bread needs time to settle. Pulling a hot loaf from the oven is just the beginning. Letting it cool properly is where patience earns its reward. Ever tried to slice a loaf right out of the oven? If you have, you know exactly how it goes. What should be neat slices collapse into a pile of steam and crumbs. That's the bread's way of telling you, not yet, buddy. Traditionally, the bread is placed on wire racks to cool, letting air circulate around it and ensuring the crust stays crisp. Skipping this step means the moisture trapped inside will sneak out, turning that beautiful crust into a sad, soggy mess. It's like ironing a shirt and then throwing it in the hamper. What was the point? Some say the Amish take this step so seriously that they'll even leave a loaf cooling for an entire day before slicing it. I've never managed that level of restraint, but they might be onto something. Cooling isn't just about keeping the bread from crumbling, it also lets the flavors develop fully. As the loaf cools, all those ingredients that worked so hard to become bread, flour, water, yeast, get a chance to mellow and blend. It's like a symphony that needs the final note to fade out before it really feels complete. If you slice too soon, the bread's flavors aren't ready, and it's like eating a song that ended halfway through. I once thought I'd beat the system by sneaking a slice while the bread was still hot. I grabbed a knife, ready to enjoy a fresh piece slathered in butter, only to watch it crumble into a sad heap. The butter melted into a puddle, the steam escaped in a huff, and what was left was more of a bread catastrophe than a snack. Lesson learned: good bread is worth the wait. And don't worry, the loaf won't disappear while it cools, unless you've got kids in the house, in which case all bets are off. Some folks think cooling is just about science, but it's also a kind of ritual. There's something meditative about that in-between time when the bread is done baking but not yet ready to eat. It's a little like waiting for tea to steep or listening to the rain. Quiet, satisfying, and strangely fulfilling. In Amish kitchens, this is often when stories are told, chores are wrapped up, or a moment of quiet reflection slips in. It's as if the bread demands not just patience, but presence too. And speaking of presence, there's a trick I picked up from an Amish baker. If you tap the bottom of a cooled loaf and it still sounds hollow, you've done everything right. It's a small, simple test, but there's a deep satisfaction in that knock-knock moment. Like the bread is giving you a little nod of approval. Once cooled, the bread is ready for slicing. Finally. But here's another tip I learned the hard way. Never use a dull knife. I once tried to cut a fresh loaf with an old blunt bread knife, and let's just say the bread fought back. A sharp knife is essential if you want those perfect slices, not a lopsided mess. And trust me, once you've waited for the bread to cool, you'll want those slices to look as good as they taste. Now that the bread is cooled and ready, the only thing left is to share it and enjoy it with your loved ones.